Hi, and welcome back to David Pattinson's Accused Friends. Today we're here with successful businessman Dan Mahony, who was awaiting trial for 7 years before the CPS offered no evidence against him. This has all the hallmarks of a malicious prosecution, and Dan is here with us today to talk about his case in more detail. Dan, how are you doing?
Very well, thank you, yes.
Now, you and I have both been falsely accused, but is it fair to say we're both friends?
Yes, I think that we can safely say that. Yes.
It's good to know. Would you mind telling us how you were on bail for so long, and then a case against you was not even brought in the end?
Yes, I mean, it's Kafkaesque. I was first arrested in January 2010 by Surrey Police and Vodafone, who raided my offices and my home. And 4 years later, I stood trial for the first time in Southwark Crown Court, accused of defrauding Vodafone. And
had you done that?
Well, no, of course not. And then I had a hung jury for reasons which I can go into later, but are very pertinent to the disclosure failings that and the general attitude of the CPS. And then I had a retrial in August to October 2014, where I was unanimously acquitted.
Okay.
But all the same time, I also had this other charge against me, which was brought under the Wireless Telegraphy Act. And whenever you tell people about the Wireless Telegraphy Act, you can see their eyes glazing over because it is so dull, it's technical. But essentially, we were accused of breaking the law because our company was using a type of equipment that was that needed a license that would be granted by Ofcom.
Okay.
It's a complex area of law because it involves EU law, and EU law explicitly allows the use of the type of equipment that we were using, whereas domestic law doesn't. But it doesn't because Ofcom didn't make the changes to the regulations that they ought to have done, and that's been a cause of challenge in the civil courts since 2003, when the duty was first put upon them.
So under that scenario, what takes precedence, EU law or domestic law?
In the current scheme of things, if an EU directive is given, it has to be implemented into domestic law within 12 months. That's across all the member states. Okay. And if it's not implemented, EU law EU law has precedence, essentially. EU law becomes domestic law.
So there was basically two kind of cases against you. There was the fraud case, which you won, and then at the same time, concurrently, there was this Wireless Telephony Act case.
Yes, that's right.
And what did that say that you'd done wrong?
Essentially, it said that we were using a piece of equipment called GSM gateways. And
your company?
My company was, yes, sorry. And in layman's terms, a GSM gateway enables calls to mobile phones to be made at a lower cost. So it's not quite as relevant now as it used to be, but years ago it used to cost a lot of money to call a mobile phone. You'd be talking 30, 40, 50p a minute. And that's because the wholesale price, which is set by Ofcom, was high. So it may be 20p a minute. So it meant that any carrier, say you were using Virgin or Sky, had to pay Vodafone, for example, if a call was being connected onto their network, 20p a minute. They then had to make their markup to you, so they'd charge you 50p a minute. Okay. So in the early 2000s, this equipment came onto the market called a GSM gateway, and it essentially converted a call from a landline to a mobile call. And I won't go into the technicalities of it, but it meant that the pricing could drop. So 15 years ago, Virgin, or Telewest as it was then, were advertising the fact that you could call a mobile phone with them cheaper than you could do if you were calling through BT. And the reason they were able to do that is because they were using companies like mine to terminate those calls. And in telecoms parlance, terminate means connect.
Okay. So let's just go back to the legal side of things. So the fraud case and the wireless telephony case, why were they connected? And if you were cleared of the fraud, why were you not cleared of the other one at the same time?
There were two distinct accusations. Okay. One was a conspiracy to defraud Vodafone, okay, and that involved accusations that my company used suppliers who had supplied us with SIM cards that were topped up with credit that was obtained through stolen credit card numbers. Okay. So that was one charge. Okay. And then obviously we benefited from that. So there was, in their mind at least, criminal benefit from
from winning.
From actually using that SIM card and terminating the traffic, supplying calls to customers. I mean, I should say these suppliers only made up a very small proportion of our overall supply,
Okay.
but that didn't really stop Surrey from pursuing us the way they did. Because what I think is unique in my case is that Vodafone made the original complaint
Okay.
that credit cards were being used in gateways in the Reigate area, which is where my offices were. And then they also advised the police that we were in breach of the Wireless Telegraphy Act. So no police force would have been alive to this. It was...
It wasn't on their radar.
No, not at all. And it wasn't on the mobile network's radar, really, because they knew that there were companies like mine, much bigger companies than mine, who were operating, and they couldn't do anything about it. The only thing that they could do in my case was identify the fact that there were some stolen credit cards that were being used on SIM cards that were in the same area as my office was. And that gave them the hook then to pull me in for the Wireless Telegraphy Act.
So the Wireless Telegraphy Act, how did this sort of case continue, in a sort of in a way where there was no resolution for such a long period of time? Because obviously you've been cleared of the fraud, that's done. Why is this one not either dropped or taken to trial at that time?
Simply because my argument was I was entitled to do what I was doing under European law. Okay. I had a right to operate the type of equipment that I was operating, and therefore the prosecution was fundamentally flawed in that regard. So that's partly why it went on so long.
So you carried on doing what you were doing, feeling that you were on legally safe ground, and you the bail was just not rescinded.
No, that's right. I mean, I should say that after in 2010, we had to shut the company down. Okay. I mean, there was no way we could carry on trading. We were done by then.
Okay.
The work I've been doing since then has just been sort of ad hoc, not always in telecoms. It's just anything to keep my head above water. So no, I mean, it had the effect of absolutely destroying the business.
I see.
So we weren't carrying on trading.
So the trading had ceased.
Yeah.
So why is this wireless telegraphy case against you continuing without resolution, is what I want to find out.
Well, because I'm arguing that the law was wrong,
okay,
and the prosecution were arguing that the law was right. Okay. But of course, what you have to understand is that after my acquittal in October 2010 of the fraud charges, I then went to court a further 25 times for hearings for legal argument as to trying to argue that the law was right, the law was wrong. Trials that never actually happened because the CPS lied to the judge about the evidence that they were able to give. I had a whole week wasted in July 2016. I mean, it's an extraordinary amount of money and time that they spent because they had a QC and a junior. I had a QC and a junior. There were always two officers from Surrey Police at court. Present. There are often people from Vodafone coming along as well.
So let's just summarise though for the viewers. You've been accused in the first instance in 2010. Your company's shut down. You then go through this long legal process lasting many, many years.
Almost 8 years.
How was that, how's this impacted your life? Because you've lost your job, you've got to pay all these legal fees, the taxpayers funding the CPS. What's going through your mind during this sort of period of time?
I can only compare it to being told you've got a terminal diagnosis of cancer or some illness that you'll never recover from. Because at first there's the shock, and then there's the denial, and then there's the fight, and then there's the acceptance. I think there are 7 stages. I've only named 4. But certainly for me, it's been devastating. Not only did I have to shut the business down, I had to sell my house in order to pay for my legal fees. I lost my partner of 12 years. It was an odd time because gradually, bit by bit, it's like death by 1,000 cuts. You have to sell your car, then you can't pay your mortgage, then you can't pay your credit card, and eventually you give everything up, you lose everything, and it's quite liberating because you think, what more can they take?
Mm-hmm. I've heard people say those sorts of stories before.
It's peculiar because you fight so hard and think, oh God, I can't, I can't sell this house. I love this place. And then you have to sell it and you think, right, there's no one chasing me for money anymore.
So where did this all end then, Dan? Bring us to the point where it's all over, the 7-year period. When were you cleared, or when did they drop it?
They offered no evidence on the 15th of September 2018.
Okay.
No, 17 actually. It's gone, you lose track of time, decades almost.
So just a year and a half or so ago.
Yeah, so it was, so that was almost 8 years in total on bail. And it ended very quickly with the prosecution counsel saying in front of the judge that the CPS were going to offer no evidence. Now, the reason they said that is because I had issued a judicial review against Ofcom for failure to implement the European directive that enabled me to operate freely with my company and the type of equipment that we were using. And Ofcom held off, and I suspect Ofcom were complicit in holding off. And Ofcom, incidentally, are the telecoms regulator. Okay. So they're the people that can make secondary legislation. The Parliament gives them the gift of allowing equipment to be used with licence or without licence, and Ofcom can choose what's to be licensed and what isn't. And it took a year and a half for them to do a consultation exercise whereby they concluded that they were in fact under a duty under the 2003 regulations to liberate the licensing regime for GSM gateways, and for that reason the prosecution had no case then, because the offence was gone.
Right. So you were on legal safe ground the entire time you were operating your business. You were not in violation of any laws.
Well, I thought so.
Right.
I mean, it was a grey area, and I think my trial judge acknowledged it was a grey area because there were lots of companies doing what we were doing, but the domestic law said you can't do it, but European law said you could.
Right.
But there was such a vast industry. You would never go into it thinking, well, I'm breaking the law here. I've never, before,
because everyone else was doing it. But were other companies charged like you were?
No, only us. And that's and I think that's only because of the allegations of fraud. That's enabled Surrey to haul us in. And then because Vodafone were in the background, well, in fact they weren't. It turns out now in the background as much as we thought.
So what role did Vodafone play in the case against you?
I would characterise their involvement as being analogous to a private prosecutor, but acting through the police. They had a vested interest in wanting to shut us down. We had dealings with Vodafone in the past. One of our suppliers, who was a huge supplier to us and other people, was visited by Vodafone a few times, and Vodafone used to have a guy who dressed up as G-Man at conferences, Gateway Man. So he'd come out in a latex suit, dressed up like Superman but with a G, and boasting about how many gateway SIMs they had cut off. So there was always a cat and mouse with the mobile networks. They didn't like gateways because they claim it reduces their revenue.
Okay.
But at the same time, at meetings I've had with Vodafone back in 2005, they were throwing SIM cards at us because they needed to get their numbers up, because for the first time in their corporate history, their numbers had dipped the previous quarter, so they were just desperate to get connections out.
So Vodafone, what do you think of them today, having gone through this case against them?
I think I don't think I could say really what I feel on camera. I think they've behaved abysmally. They, as I say, they've acted essentially as a private prosecutor. That, it's an extraordinary situation that you could have in this country. You could have your offices raided by Vodafone, have your equipment taken to Newbury, their headquarters, copied and examined there. That they do all the forensic work, they do their own investigations into your activities, your contacts. Now they've got all your contacts, they've got your company history. They can suddenly this is manna from heaven for them. They can do what they like, and
without any recourse.
Without any recourse, exactly, because it's crime prevention. So who can argue with crime prevention? they're on to a winner.
Now, you made in a previous statement where you describe your case as the most extraordinary tale of corruption, cover-ups, incompetence and sheer malice. Has your opinion on the British justice system changed between the time you were falsely accused and today?
It's got worse.
Okay.
Yeah, it certainly hasn't got better. And I remember at school, I went to a Catholic school, and we were always taught that the institution of the church was divine, was flawless, and it was the people inside it that were wrong. And I'd like to be able to say that the criminal justice system is divine in that same way, or flawless, and it's the people in it that's wrong, but it's not. The whole thing stinks. The whole edifice, the whole building of it, everything from the police to the CPS to council to solicitors, it's corrupt. And it's not just a few bad apples. Often you hear that
system-wide.
Yes.
And have you sort of highlighted your case to the press, or have you got what kind of action have you taken about pushing back against the system since you were cleared?
While it was going on, I couldn't do a great deal because there was an active trial going on, and the press are very careful about what they can say and what they can't say about an ongoing trial because it might prejudice it. So there were some articles in the Times about me while the trial was going on, which were reasonably anodyne, in that they were just reporting, the fact that I'd been on bail for such a long time, and wasn't it awful?
Okay, so it wasn't particularly hard-hitting, or
no, it wasn't, and
it was just pro forma.
And honestly, the subject of it is boring. GSM gateways, it's dull. If it's sex or kiddie fiddling, that sells.
Yeah.
People can identify with that straight away. Whereas for me, it's telecoms, it's bringing
complicated.
The cost of your calls down. You can see people's eyes glazing as you start talking to them. So it's the real anchor for me was the length of time on bail. That I think is what people can identify with most of all, and that's I think what's most horrifying about my case. And I say horrifying.
And so have you taken any legal action against the police or the CPS?
I'm in the process of complaints at the moment,
okay.
But of course when the boot's on the other foot, they really drag their heels. I mean, to give you an example, the complaint I made about Surrey Police I made 2 years ago. I recently had their findings in, and on the matter of the allegations that my equipment may have been tampered with while it was in the possession of Vodafone, Surrey Police asked Vodafone to investigate themselves to see if they had done any wrongdoing, and they said no. Surprise, surprise.
Have you had any sort of advocates speaking out on your behalf in the public domain about this? I understand you've been in touch with members of Parliament and have having them take a look at it. Is that correct?
That's right. Yes. My MP is Bob Neal, and he's the chair of the Commons Justice Committee, and I've met with him a few times, and he's actually been a great support. He's very sensible, very sound, and I think for him the most shocking thing was the length of time it's gone on for, because it's when you're on bail, it's a hard thing to describe to someone who hasn't been on bail or who hasn't been through the court process, but it's all consuming. Every living minute it's in the back of your mind. Very often it's at the front of your mind. You're thinking about what you should say next, what you should do next, whether you'll have to sell the house, what career will you have, will I go to prison? It completely consumes your life.
It's being a state of limbo.
To be in that state for 6 months is awful. 6 years is perverse.
How much, Matt, are you able to tell us how much this has cost you in actual pounds spent? I know you've lost your business and your home and stuff, and that's very, very bad. But the amount of money you spent on legal fees.
I think, we've totted this up, and it is a very general figure. We're looking at about 800,000 I spent on legal fees.
And is there any way you can get any of this money
No,
back?
because and this is where the system's so bent. Really, it's so against the defendants, because when I started out, I went privately because I wouldn't have qualified for legal aid.
Okay.
And we had a very dynamic firm based not too far in Farringdon, and for the first couple of years, we were paying them in the region of 10, 20 grand a month. I mean, it was big money. And then, as I say, the business collapsed, and I was trying to do different things, but ultimately I didn't have any money left, so it just dries up. And then you have to move on to legal aid. And when you move on to legal aid, you give up your right to claim back any costs that you paid privately.
Right.
So
I didn't know that.
That's gone.
Yeah.
And then when you move on to legal aid, of course, it's based on your earnings. So it's not free. You still have to pay them. You
contribute
over 5 or 6 months. Fairly hefty chunk of change. So I reckon, when I look at the ruined stock that we had and the legal expenses, I'm probably touching £1 million in total.
Yeah, that's big. And what about the British taxpayers? Do you have any idea how much they've spent on the case against you?
Well, to give you an idea, at court this was described as Surrey Police's biggest ever case, and they threw so much resource at it. We had, when I was first arrested, there were 30 police at our offices, and there were 5 Vodafone employees. And ever since then, as I say, I've had nearly 6 months of trials in 2014, each of which has been with a silk and a junior, on my side. So I can't imagine how much it's cost. It would be more than £1 million.
Yeah,
probably,
really?
3-4 million, I would say, in all, because it was just a relentless pursuit. You hear all this talk about austerity and the CPS not having
enough
money and policing being short, short supply. It's rubbish. It's rubbish. If they've got it in for you, if they want to go for you, they'll throw everything at it. They will not stop. They will not hold back. So don't ever believe what you read that the CPS is in trouble. They're in trouble because it's of their own making.
Yeah.
They decide they're going to go for you, and even if they think, well, the case might not be that great, if they don't like you, or if they think, we lost that case, let's get some comfort on this one, they'll throw anything at it.
Just looking at sort of a general overview of your whole case, it seems like there was a sort of almost like a political agenda, or a kind of like a vendetta. Did you feel that? And also looking back, what might you have done differently in hindsight from the start to tackle this challenge?
With hindsight, so I'm answering your question in reverse order. With hindsight, it's difficult to see what I would have done differently, because unless you've been in the system, you don't really know how it works. So what would I say I'd do differently? Well, I'll probably have a solicitor with me for an interview, because when you're first arrested, you think, well, I didn't do this, so I don't need a solicitor. You really do. And I'd probably do my research better about what counsel we approach, because one of my co-defendants, it turns out that his counsel was married to a director of Talk Mobile, who claimed to be the victim of our company's activities. So there's all these things that you can point to, but until you're in it, it's difficult to say what you would do differently in hindsight, because I don't know if you ever watched Blackadder, but there was a phrase where Stephen Fry's character says, you twist and turn like a twisty-turny thing, and my case really twisted and turned like a twisty-turny thing. It would just, the most unexpected things would happen. You get this legal argument that we won, and you think, fantastic. And then the prosecution would come back in with something, and it would turn back, and it went on for such a long time that inevitably it twists and turns all the time, and it is difficult to say what would you do differently.
And what about the sort of, was there a political vendetta you feel like against you?
You sound like a crazed, conspiracy theorist if you say that there was some sort of political vendetta, but I genuinely believe there was. This particular matter, the Wireless Telegraphy Act matter, had been argued by lots of people since 2003. It had been argued in the civil system, and I think that there was a point at which the government thought, you know what, we've really made a boo-boo here. But the cost of admitting that boo-boo is too great. So
they have to
therefore,
keep
we need to cross the Rubicon and just carry on going. And
Hope
what
for a
would
break.
be, well, I think what they thought in my case was if I could be convicted under the current legislation, or the legislation that I was being accused of having broken, then the civil cases would just drop dead, because the government would then be able to say, well, look, the law is obviously good enough to convict this man. So if the law was no good, it wouldn't convict, would it? And then that would sort of kill any civil cases
Against
and
the
any
government.
possible claims against the government stone dead.
Yeah.
So I think that
There's a
there
vested
was
interest to get you convicted under that.
Yes.
And then just finally, Dan, what advice can you give for men watching this, or any British citizen that's been falsely accused? I appreciate you've got a sort of a unique case, but having to go through the legal process, what advice would you give to someone that's just been falsely accused and is facing a charge?
Believe in yourself. Believe in yourself and keep buggering on, because they will grind you down. And going back to the analogy I gave about the acceptance, like the stages of cancer, accept that your life is going to be turned upside down. Accept that you're going to lose things. Keep what's precious around you. Keep your family, keep your friends, some of whom may desert you, of course. But keep your faith, and know that everything is going to change and your life will never be the same again. And it's much easier then to keep moving forward, because if you just keep looking back and thinking, oh crikey, I don't want to lose that car, you become fixated by it, and you've got to clear your name, and you can't be held back, you can't be encumbered by the baggage of your previous life. Everything changes when you get arrested, and you just need to accept that